So in my opinion, the track saw is one of the most essential tools in any woodworking shop, and this is especially true if you have a smaller shop and maybe don't have access to a table saw, if you're working with a lot of sheet goods like plywood or MDF, or even if you work with a lot of hardwoods and don't have a jointer to get a nice straight clean line on your pieces. And I've owned at least half a dozen track saws over the years, and these aren't even all the ones I've owned, believe it or not, and I've been recommending them in my videos for years. So I guess before we get any further, let me explain what a track saw is if you're not familiar with them. You can basically think of them as circular saws on steroids. As the name implies, the saw rides on a track, which is usually a piece of extruded aluminum. Wherever you set this track on the piece you're working with, the edge of that track will be exactly where the blade cuts, so it makes it very easy to make cuts without measuring any offsets like you would have to do with a typical circular saw. The blades themselves are also enclosed, so they have very good dust collection. A lot of these saws also have a riving knife, which is a really great safety feature. It keeps your workpiece from closing up on the blade, which can cause kickback. And one of the coolest functionalities of pretty much every track saw is that they have a plunge mechanism that allows you to make cuts in the middle of a workpiece, which is usually really challenging to do, and this can come in handy in a lot of different situations. So according to the internet, Festool invented the track saw back in the 1960s, and then they invented the plunge saw in 1980. And it was a major revolution in the world of woodworking and carpentry. And for a lot of years, Festool dominated the track saw market, and that's part of what's made it hard for me to recommend track saws, because if you know anything about Festool, their prices are essentially a meme in the woodworking world. They can be extremely expensive. And speaking of which, let's go over a list of some of the prices of some of the more popular track saws out on the market, just so you can get an idea of how expensive some of these things are. And also I should mention that all these prices include a 55-inch-ish track and the battery if it's a cordless tool. So first up is the Festool TS55, and I really think this is the track saw that pretty much every other track saw is trying to compete with, and it comes in at a price point of $729. Next on the list is actually a saw I've never used before, and that's the Makita corded track saw, which comes in at $519. Next is the DeWalt corded version, which is $549. The cordless FlexVolt version, which I have here, is $619. Milwaukee's cordless version comes in at $756. Bosch, believe it or not, tops the list price-wise, coming in at $788, which is pretty crazy. Just the saw by itself with no track is $639. So I don't know how they justify those prices, but that seems pretty dang expensive to me. One of the newer track saws on the market is this Craig ACS track saw, which I have a lot of experience with, and it comes in at $348, which I think is a great value. And then last but not least, coming in at the bargain barrel price of $153, probably the reason you clicked on this video in the first place, is the WEN track saw, which, funny enough, that $153 actually includes 2 tracks, because I couldn't even find a version of this saw to buy with just 1 track, so you'll basically be able to rip a full-length 8-foot sheet of plywood out of the box with those 2 tracks. So what I want to do in this video is basically compare some of the functionalities of these saws against each other, especially looking at the WEN to see if some of these other saws are worth 4 to 5 times the price, which I'm guessing even before ever having turned on this saw, the answer is going to be no. And that's because I think a common misconception in the world of tools is that everybody out there needs a professional grade or job site durable type tool, and it's just not true. I'm sure a lot of you watching this video probably only have time to do this kind of work on the weekends and things like that, so these tools are not going to see long, everyday use like they would in a professional shop environment. And so if that's the case, why would you spend 5 times as much on one of these more expensive saws when you could spend that same money and invest it on other tools? And if this one fails, you can just go out and buy another one or try to get some sort of warranty claim on it, which I don't even know if that exists with this WEN brand. But to be honest, the saw itself is only $80, so even if you only got 3 or 4 projects out of it, that would probably be worth it. But anyway, getting off of my soapbox, I'm going to be testing some of the kind of base functionalities every track saw should be able to do, including obviously cutting in a nice straight line, breaking down sheet goods, cutting bevels, because another thing I didn't mention is that all of these saws have a base that allows the saw to tilt, and that's really great if you're doing mitered corners on cabinetry and things like that. I'll test ripping some solid hardwoods, and that's where I really think some of the differences in these saws might become more apparent, because obviously if you have an underpowered motor, it's going to have a very hard time cutting through solid hardwoods. And I'll also test out some of the different track saw accessories I have to see if the ones that work with my Festool saw will also work with something like my WEN saw. So let's head over to my assembly table and start breaking down some sheet goods to start. So the first pro tip I have for you if you're looking at getting a track saw is to go out and buy some foam board, just this rigid foam insulation, because you can set it on whatever work surface you have, whether that's just a sheet of plywood on some sawhorses or an assembly table like I have. And then rather than the blade cutting into the surface of your workbench, it'll cut into this foam, and one sheet of foam will last for years and years. So we'll start the test with something super simple, and that's just gonna be ripping the factory edge off of a sheet of 1/4-inch plywood, which should be pretty darn easy. But since these tracks on the WEN saw are both brand new, as you can see, there's this little sacrificial strip here, and these come from the factory oversized, so you can cut them with your saw, so you know exactly whatever blade you have set up on your saw matches up with the sacrificial strip. So wherever the edge of this strip is exactly where the blade is gonna cut. So obviously I have two 55-inch tracks here, so I need to tie them together, which is pretty easy. There's a little bar here that connects both tracks to each other. So now I can go ahead and cut this sacrificial strip, and then we'll be able to make the cut on the piece of plywood. That seemed to go pretty smooth. So now that that's done, I'm gonna go ahead and rip off about 1 inch of this plywood. One of these corners got damaged during shipping, so this should be a perfect test for the ripping capacity of this saw. Again, this is only 1/4-inch plywood, so not a huge task, I'm guessing. Set the depth here, and we should be good to go. Well, looks pretty good. No tear out or anything. That looks good. I mean, I should mention that I did change the blade before getting started with all this stuff, because the stock blade from WEN is a much lower tooth count blade that's kind of, I guess, meant for general purpose use. So I immediately changed that to a higher tooth count blade, and it's looking really good. So now I want to do a crosscut to basically break these pieces into more manageable sizes so I can take them to the table saw. And of course, to make that crosscut manageable, now I need to take these two tracks apart. Probably should have just bought 2 sets of tracks, but what are you gonna do? So one of the more challenging things to do when using a track saw is to get the track square to whatever piece you're working on. There are lots of different options out there. I've been using this little square attachment from TSO products for years, and this one's made for my Festool track, but as it happens, it also fits this WEN track, which is kind of insane. So then this will be my square kind of reference when I'm putting it up against the edge of the plywood. And now all I need to do is make a mark at my measurement and go ahead and make the cut. Now we can check this corner for square. That looks pretty dang good. So then I'm just making a couple marks here to indicate which ones are the edge that I have cut already. So that way when I go over to my table saw, I'll have this edge and this edge up against the fence. So let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Basis Security, and their new S1 Pro camera, the world's first sun-powered tracking system camera. Obviously, security is a pretty important thing here at my shop, but traditional security cameras are a real pain, especially considering the size of my shop, because of all the wiring you have to run. And that's where this S1 Pro camera from Basis Security comes in, because this thing is completely wire-free. The installation of the 2 cameras took just a few minutes, and I could put them anywhere they would receive sunlight because these cameras are solar charged. But these cameras have a pretty cool trick up their sleeve, and that is the sun-powered solar tracking. These cameras can automatically move their solar panels so that they maximize solar efficiency. And this is great because I've had a lot of solar powered security cameras in the past that just weren't able to keep themselves charged depending on the season and depending on where the sun was in the sky. These S1 Pro cameras sport dual 3K lenses, and the image quality is great. You get a 120-degree field of view with the wide-angle lens, and the 8X telephoto lens is perfect for close-up viewing. The cameras are IP67 rated to withstand any weather condition, and the smart features are top-notch with advanced AI detection, easy activity zone creation, two-way audio, and voice assistant integration. Best of all, the cameras connect to the H1 home station, which means all of your recordings are stored locally with no monthly cloud subscription fees and no risk of security leaks. All in all, I think these Basis Security S1 Pro cameras are an awesome option for your security needs, whether that's at your house, your shop, or your business. So click the link in the video description below if you want to check them out, and let's get back to the project. All right, so obviously 1/4-inch plywood was pretty easy, so I've bumped up to a little bit more of a challenge, this 3/4 inch sheet of plywood, but the real kicker is that it has this very fancy laminate pattern on the top. I really don't want any tear out, so hopefully this track saw does its job. Another cool little track saw accessory I have are these little Craig parallel guides that's designed for their track system, but as luck would have it, they also seem to work fine with this WEN track. So I'm gonna do a rip cut at 44 inches. I basically calibrated these parallel guides to match, and so I should just be able to pull the tape out on the parallel guides, set it to 44 inches, and then make my cut. The other feature I figured I could test out with this laminate is the scoring functionality. And I think this basically just limits the blade depth on the first pass. That way you make sure you get a really nice clean cut if you have a panel with a more sensitive veneer like this, and then you can do a second pass at full depth. That might have been set up with the original blade. Oh man, I think the blade I installed is slightly smaller in diameter. Can't do the scoring pass unless I just manually change the depth. Oh well. All right, one thing I do not like, this thing needs a longer cord. Pretty dang good. Got a 1/16 off, over 8 feet with these little measuring tape set up. So I maybe wouldn't use these parallel guides for super precision work, but definitely good for breaking down bulk material. All right, now let's test the gold standard TS55 on this same plywood. They don't feel that different, to be quite honest. On to the next test. All right, so for my hardwood test, I've got these random scraps of walnut. This piece has a big old chunk of sapwood on the edge that I would be cutting off if I were to ever use it. So let's go ahead and do that with this track saw. So when I am cutting hardwood like this with a track saw, especially one this size that's definitely not really designed for cutting this thick of hardwood, I usually do it in 2 passes. So let's see how deep this actually is, just over 1.5 inches. So let's start at 3/4 of an inch now. I don't love this depth adjustment knob either. Okay, here goes first pass. And it's not plugged in. Okay, that was pretty smooth, really. Man, so that blade being a smaller diameter basically throws off the entire measuring gauge on this thing too, so I need to not have a metric blade on here. I mean, that's pretty dang clean. It didn't bog down too bad. Honestly, I know the Festival is gonna be pretty similar. Let's try that one. All right, same deal. I'll do it in 2 passes. There is not much difference between those two. Now, to be fair...
Well, to be fair...
Oh, don't say to be fair. I hate when people say to be fair.
To be fair, the WEN does have a brand new blade on it, and this is, I think, the original blade that came with the Festival, so I've made thousands of cuts with the Festival, so still, though, that's pretty impressive, and I definitely don't think the motor felt much more powerful. So this says 1200 watts, 10 amps. Okay, so they have the same motor power. Pretty crazy. So the WEN saw did fine on walnut in 2 passes, but figured I would bump it up 1 more notch and try this soft maple in 1 pass. And so once again, this is not how I would typically make this cut if I were actually doing it, but I figured let's just see what happens if it can actually cut through this piece of material. Let's see. It's just under 2 inches thick, so I think this is gonna be pretty tough for both the WEN saw and my Festool TS55. And typically if I'm gonna be cutting through thicker material like this, like when I'm breaking down some of the slabs I work with, I'll bump up to the TS75, which is really more designed for this type of work. It's got a larger diameter blade, it's got a more powerful motor, but it's also a lot heavier, so I don't use it when I'm working with sheet goods and thinner material. So the other thing you might have noticed is that I haven't been clamping down the track in any of these cuts, and that's because when you're working with things like plywood, the grippy surface on the bottom of these tracks will generally hold the track in place. You're not typically going to be dealing with much kickback when working with stuff like plywood, but when I'm working with hardwoods, especially something like maple, which I find has the tendency to close up on my blade, I will definitely clamp the track in place just for safety. And so this cut in particular is a great example of another use case for a track saw in a woodworking shop, because if you don't have a jointer, or if you have a particularly long board that would be hard to run over your jointer, you can use your track saw to get a nice, clean, straight, pretty much glue ready edge, and then you can take this essentially jointed board over to the table saw and rip the other edge parallel. So when it comes to clamping, I have a few different styles of track saw clamps. These are obviously made by Festool. I also have these ones made by DeWalt, which I think are a little bit cheaper. Both work pretty much exactly the same. That being said, as you can see, sometimes this ratchet style is harder to use if you don't have enough overhang. I'll switch to the DeWalt clamp in this situation. There you go. So we're pretty much going to max depth here with the TS55, so we'll see how this goes. I'm not super confident. One other big tip is when you are cutting into hardwoods like this, you always want to start your blade outside of the wood, because that's going to help to reduce your kickback. Wow, yeah, this does not like this. Yeah, I think the thermal overload on this saw is basically telling me to stop. We'll give the Festool a little breather then. Okay, so once again, we are at pretty much full depth here. Let's see how the WEN does. I'm basically just gonna finish the cut I had already started, because this test is admittedly kind of stupid. Whoop. And there's your kickback. Dingus, duh. I wasn't perfectly in the slot there. So it's probably because the WEN has a lot newer blade on it, but as you can see, it did pretty much just as well. It actually did, I think, better on this test than the Festool did. Cut quality is similar. I would maybe give the WEN to the Festool probably. Pretty dang solid results. All right, so I think we've established that this WEN saw can make straight cuts in plywood and hardwoods without really any issues. So let's move on to cutting some bevels. And this is another thing that track saws really excel at. If you're doing cabinet boxes with mitered corners, waterfall, tabletops, or countertops, the track saw is the perfect tool, because even if you have a table saw, it can be a little tricky to do some of this work at the table saw. So I've never cut a bevel using this saw, so I'm gonna go ahead and make the first cut, setting it to the 45-degree notch with the factory settings, and see how close we are, and then I might need to do a little bit of tweaking from there. But my plan is to basically just cut 4 panels out of this scrap piece of plywood, put them all together, and see how those mitered corners come together. Now, one thing I will say is that the amount of plastic on this saw does not instill as much confidence as something like my Festool saw. Almost everything on here feels like it's plastic except for the base and a few of these other parts. And I guess this doesn't have a hard stop at 45 degrees. Well, I guess I'll just eyeball it. So another tip when you're cutting these kind of 45-degree angles with the track saw, as you can see, the saw wants to kind of tip off of the track. So this saw actually has a track lock functionality. So I can actually lock it to the track, which is pretty convenient. I'm still gonna have my hand putting pressure on this base, because as you can see, even with that track lock, there's still quite a bit of play there. My foam board was slipping on me. That is pretty much dead on. That's pretty good. Okay, on to the next cut. Oh my God, cannot believe that. So somehow I forgot to hit record when cutting the rest of these pieces, but it's basically just the same thing over and over again. Unfortunately, this piece of plywood I decided to use had a pretty good warp in it, so let's see if I can get this thing together to actually see how the miters looked. And it's one of those tools I didn't really think I'd be using, but this is probably a pretty good use case for it. pretty much dead square. Wow, okay. Okay, now the middle, which is pretty dang good actually. Wow, holy moly. So I'm actually very impressed by the results here. Those are some extremely tight miters. I would be plenty happy with those if I was doing a project, because there might be a tiny, tiny little gap, but the old screwdriver trick is rub the corner. Basically all that's doing is pushing those wood fibers together, and I mean, that is about as close to perfect as I would ever really need. Very impressive. I mean, that's pretty good. And you can see you got perfect waterfall grain here. Just wraps right around. Well, so if I'm being honest, was not expecting those results. I'm really annoyed that I was not recording during all of the miter cuts, but this box is perfectly square. The corners look really good, very minimal tear out. And this is one of the harder things to do this with, because this is a very thin veneered kind of a hardwood plywood. So if you're doing this with solid wood, it would be even easier to get these corners looking super nice. And overall, I am definitely impressed. So what are my thoughts on this WEN saw? Well, it's really too early to tell. I've made all of 10 cuts with this saw, so I don't know how well it's gonna hold up to extended use, but as you can probably tell from the video, I'm pretty impressed. So more importantly, who do I think this saw is for? And I would say if you are just getting into woodworking and maybe you don't have access to a table saw or have a smaller job site table saw, I think this would be a great addition to your shop. And even if you've been woodworking for a while and maybe have a big cabinetry project coming up, I think this would be a great tool to pick up. Do I think it's the best choice for a professional shop or someone who builds furniture day in and day out? Probably not. I think I would strongly consider something like the Festool. I've had that saw for probably 7 or 8 years at this point, and it has never failed me. Also, if you're gonna be getting into the Festool ecosystem anyway, their plug-it system is amazing. And as you saw in the video, one of my biggest complaints was the cord on this saw. So really, it's all gonna come down to your budget at the end of the day and how you want to spend your money. So if you want to check out this saw, this was not sponsored in any way. I bought this with my own money. I'll link to this saw in the video description below, along with the other saws and accessories I featured in this video. If it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And last, while you're here, why not check out this other video of mine that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.